Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to all that are joining us at this important session as part of LOCS4Africa 2020. The title of this session is Narrowing the Climate Data Gap for Improved Project Preparation in Cities. We as ICLEI Africa and our partners, the IDRC and others, felt this was a really important topic to tackle. Many African cities know what challenges they face, they have projects prepared, and they want implementation on the ground. And one of the significant challenges and gaps has been in access to data and a clear understanding of what the climate change impacts are in their cities now and will be in the future, and making sure that those projects and plans are adaptable, structured correctly, and will last in the long term. This is what our speakers today will be reflecting on, both in terms of prepared speeches and then in some reflections from an additional panel. So welcome to one and all. I, Megan Spires from ICLEI Africa, will be facilitating this session. I have a co-facilitator in Dr. Catherine Torre from the IDRC. And before we get started, I'd like to run us through a few items and how today's session will work. First of all, to say that we really would like to encourage participation in this session. So please submit questions in the panel to the right of the video at any time during the session, both during the speeches and during the reflections from our various panelists, and we'll see how many of the questions we can field. We also want to encourage the discussion to continue. This is really the start of these discussions, and we have the social lounge available to us as part of our platform here at LOCS4Africa 2020. So please feel free after the session to see who's online and willing to chat, and these conversations can continue during the Congress. Now I'd like to introduce our various speakers. We're very privileged to have a long list of well-known speakers from across the continent and the globe. And we've also got an Excellency Mayor Omar Ba joining us, which is wonderful. Our first speaker is Mr. Olufonso Somoran, and he's the Regional Principal Officer for the Climate Change and Green Growth Program at the African Development Bank, and he's based in Nairobi, Kenya. He joins us live today. Our second speaker is His Excellency Mayor Omar Ba of Indiob, Senegal. Mayor Ba chairs the Network of Green Municipalities and Cities of Senegal, and when I was reading his biography last night, I was really amazed at the significant work that the mayor is leading in his town, particularly related to food and agriculture and climate change. So we're very interested to hear your presentation, Honourable Mayor. We also have Dr. David Dodman, who's our third speaker. He's the director of the Human Settlements Group at the International Institute for Environment and Development. We all know it as IED. And like our colleagues and partners, the IDRC, IED has for many years, in fact decades, been leading research into development work, making sure that the research that is conducted is applied on the ground. So we're very interested to hear David's reflections. Our fourth speaker is Catherine Higham. She's the Regional Manager for Europe, Middle East, and African Cities, States, and Regions at CDP. CDP is a strong partner of ICLEI's. We've worked together for many years, gathering data from cities from around the world and feeding that into our merged platform, the CDP-ICLEI Unified Reporting Platform. So Catherine will reflect on her experience in gathering this data from cities and then reflecting it and analyzing it. And then from Harare, Zimbabwe, our fifth speaker is Mr. Kudzai Ndizano, who is the Deputy Director of the Climate Change Management Department in the Ministry of Environment, Climate Change, Tourism and Hospitality. And we're very excited in particular to have Mr. Ndizano with us, in fact, because we have been working in Zimbabwe and in fact in Malawi too on a project that the IDRC is funding. The Impact project that we'll share briefly with the participants here today. And during this project, we've been working on a particular topic of how do we improve collaboration so that climate resilient development can be enabled. And very early on in the project, although its focus was at the city scale, we realized that the fundamental issue we needed to be tackling was how to improve vertical integration. National government working closer with local governments, collaborating in very tangible ways to achieve climate resilient development. And so Mr. Ndizano will reflect from a national government perspective the importance of the topic of climate change, the topic of climate data, and working with local governments. Our sixth speaker is Professor Richard Jones Richard is a climate scientist and a science fellow in the UK Met Office Hadley Centre. He's been working for many years, authoring numerous IPCC chapters with others on developing regional climate information that is relevant to developing countries. We know Richard in particular as ICLEI very well, as he's been working on the future Climate Resilience for African Cities project, the Fractal project, for the last 5 years with the University of Cape Town, specifically looking at this topic of how do we improve the climate information that is available from scientists and co-developing it with city practitioners so they can use that information to plan better. We then, after these more formal speaker inputs, will hear from a number of panelists who will reflect on what they've heard and offer some insights. And first up in that regard is Professor Colleen Vogel. Colleen is a distinguished professor in the Global Change Institute at Wits University, South Africa. And Colleen is a wonderful mix of a physical and a social scientist. She's a climatologist as well as an adaptation and sustainability specialist. So we're particularly interested to hear her reflections. And she's been on the ICLEI LOCS journey for many years. In fact, our last LOCS, I remember very fondly at the closing plenary, Colleen offering some very insightful remarks. And we hosted that in Ekurhuleni, South Africa. We also have as one of our reflection panelists, Dr. Valentina Paloma. She's from the European Commission's Joint Research Centre. We've been also working with the Joint Research Centre for many years in the Covenant of Mayors in Sub-Saharan Africa initiative, which is a core partner of LOCS4Africa 2020. And in particular with the JRC, we have been working on how cities can use their climate change plans and can feed good data into those climate change plans to implement projects that are planned for well and include climate change information. So we're interested very much to hear from Dr. Palomo's experience in that regard. And then lastly, but certainly not least, we have Dr. Daniel Hornweg. He's the Associate Professor, Associate Dean, and Richard Marcoux Chair at Ontario Tech University, and he too will be providing some reflections. So these are our esteemed speakers. We've got a jam-packed session. It's going to be very, very interesting. Please, as I said, add your questions and comments into the Q&A box at any time. And if you experience any difficulties with translation or any of the other platform challenges, please go to the support desk at any time and we will deal with those as soon as possible. Maybe one more reflection just from my side is to say thank you to one and all for attending. And I'm now about to hand over to my fellow co-facilitator, Dr. Catherine Torre. She is the Regional Director for East and Southern Africa for the IDRC, which is Canada's International Development Research Centre. And as said a bit earlier when reflecting on David and IED, we're particularly proud to partner with the IDRC. This session is made possible by them because it's an institute that works so hard to ensure that the research that they fund and the research that they conduct is implemented on the ground. And our journey with them over the last 3 years, particularly in Zimbabwe and Malawi, has been extremely fruitful. They're one of those funders that allows the flexibility that the work we do can really matter to our city stakeholders. And it's my great pleasure to therefore hand over to you, Catherine.
Thank you so much, Megan. Just confirm that you can hear me, Megan?
Perfectly clear, Catherine.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to co-facilitate this session with you. Welcome to all participants from across the continent and beyond. Soyez les bienvenus. And as we say here in Kenya, karibuni. This session, co-facilitated by ICLEI and IDRC, will be informative and stimulating. And we'll be discussing overcoming data hurdles to secure funding for much needed climate action in cities. As Megan said, I am with Canada's International Development Research Centre, known as IDRC. We've been funding research in Africa and beyond for 50 years. As Regional Director for Eastern and Southern Africa, I am based in Nairobi with a team of about 30 people. And IDRC also has a regional office in Dakar for West and Central Africa. To set the stage for our discussion, I would like to say a word about some IDRC-funded action-oriented research. In collaboration with donors, IDRC has supported research on climate change adaptation across the African continent for over 15 years. And we distilled some of the findings into a publication available on the web I invite you to have a look at it. It is titled IDRC Contributions to Climate Action. One important learning is how different knowledge actors can be mobilized to develop strategies that address climate change and also contribute to equitable societies. Let me give one example. Researchers from an Angolan organization called Development Workshop helped improve resilience in 4 coastal cities in Angola, where more than half of the Angola's population of 31 million people live. They influenced urban planning, and they engaged the government to develop early warning systems. So what were the keys to their success? First, they developed detailed climate risk maps for the coastal cities. And second, they worked in participatory ways with communities, civil society, and municipal and national government representatives. So collaborations and relationships are fundamental for effective climate action. And as Megan said, we will hear later about the work going on in Zimbabwe and Malawi to facilitate collaboration and planning for more resilient, for more climate resilient development in cities of Zimbabwe and Malawi. So despite all of the progress, it's still a challenge to obtain the financing that's needed for climate action in cities. And we know that the Green Climate Fund and development banks that disperse climate finance call for robust project proposals that address highly contextualized climate challenges and that demonstrate a range of possible solutions with cost-benefit analysis. In our session today, a stellar group of experts will speak to why it is so important for cities and municipalities to draw on evidence when developing project proposals to secure climate finance. I hope we will also hear about the importance of data desegregated by sex and gender. As Megan said, we invite you to share your questions and comments in the questions pane, and we hope to take some of those questions after hearing from our panelists. So without further ado, I would like to turn to our first panelist, Dr. Olufunso Somarin. We would like to hear about your experience in relation to the topic from the perspective of a bank. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you to the organizers for putting this together. And we're very grateful at the African Development Bank to be part of this. Before I go into that, let me also confirm that indeed IDRC has been part of supporting the work on climate change adaptation across Africa. 12 years ago, I was based in Cameroon working on a project funded by IDRC looking into climate change adaptation in the Congo Basin forest. And indeed, we were collecting a lot of data about the reality of climate impact to forests and agricultural dependent communities, but also trying to get a sense of the adaptive capacity as well as the options available for them. So, and good, and I think this is what this conversation is about. There's a bit of a historical partnership across many of the organizations represented here. The question of today is quite very important, and I think I want to speak from the perspective of a banker, a development institution that is very much aware of the challenge of data, lack of it, in many of our African countries, and how we're trying to get around it. I'm going to leave. I know that we've got a wonderful panel of climate scientists, climatologists, and they will speak to the question of why it's really hard to get data in Africa. But I want to spend these few minutes to emphasize on what we need to do differently. Now that, given that most of the funding agencies out there, most of the climate funds available are currently demanding, data, evidence-based climate impact on the ground with the use of data. And oftentimes in Africa, when you interpret that demand, especially you think of a proposal for Green Climate Fund that is going to be asking you for data over the last 30 years to show climate impact on the ground. The reality is, obviously, we all agree that the impact has been there. but it has not been documented in a data form that some of the development agencies are asking for today. And I think that the conversation becomes a two-way conversation. So on the one hand, we have to speak to the funding agencies to understand the peculiar reality of Africa. On the other hand, as well, we have to speak to the African society, the economy, the government, the partners, the local people, and understanding the value of data beyond meteorological data. And I think one of the missing points in our experience on the ground is we have not created a system of storytelling, a system of compiling these realities that they face. They may not involve, how much rainfall in a particular day, or how much what is the temperature over a period of a month. And I think this is where we need to start looking into the notion of what I call multiplicity of data. So think, for instance, if a road was built 40 years ago, and this road was built with the best of engineering designs possible, and it was built to last for 40 years. But due to impact of flooding, impact of changes in temperature over time, the road didn't make it to 40 years. And over the course of the shelf life of the road, there have been a number of improvements, a number of innovations done by either local government or central government. And I think for me, this is very important as well, that we are able to capture this in a form to show as well how the cost of maintaining roads increasing over years in many of our countries. And this is largely due to impact of changes in climatic systems. I mean, also amongst other things as well. Again, think about how we can get storylines from insurance companies that are able to say that, insurance premiums, payments to, agriculture-related disasters are on the increase. So we may not have data over 30 years, meteorological data. There are storylines that we can document in a very systematic way to push the idea and also to make a convincing case of the reality of climate change in Africa. And think again about how you have a situation around, the fact that you're collecting even this meteorological data, the stations are there, and you are able to extrapolate the data and to make sense of the fact that over time, we've had changes over decades. And we've seen, the severity of some of the drought crisis we're facing. I'm currently in Nairobi, and if you've been in the Horn of Africa for the past 10 years, you've seen a lot of the humanitarian crisis that we are faced over time. So the first thing we need to do is to create a system that accepts multiple storylines that can speak to the same challenge. And that challenge is the impact of climate change, and ultimately leading to the adaptation rationale in our project development. The second point is probably what the bank is doing as well, is using its convening power to create a new narrative, and also to help other donors and other funding agencies to see how we should look at Africa differently. We cannot expect, and we should not expect, that we can have a common one-size-fits-all approach for all regions of the world. We must be able to look at some of the nuances in different regions of the world. And at the African Development Bank, we're increasingly holding this conversation within the community of funding agencies, but also within our home countries as well. We realize that the data we're talking about is not only good for project development. This data is also good for our own planning. It's also good for our own disaster management. It's also good for matching early warning matching early actions with early warning as well. So we have created a fund within the bank, which is as a result of the tripartite partnership with African Union Commission, as well as the Economic Commission for Africa. And that is the CDSF, is a climate development special fund. And basically the bank is investing a lot in the technology, in the capacity building, as well as institutional strengthening capabilities that we need in many African countries in order to systematically collect data. but it's not just a collection of data. It's also the ability to analyze this data over time and make sure that they're also available for project developers to be able to achieve this climate rationale that we're talking about. There are a lot of things to talk about. I'd like to keep it there for now. And I know this is a conversation, and hopefully we'll be able to answer some other specific questions. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you so much, Funzo, and thank you for talking about how to get data to tell the stories that we need to know to inform our action. Thank you so much. Et puis, je vais changer en français. So for those who would like, we will be hearing from the mayor now, and he will be speaking in French. So if you would like interpretation, please look for that on your screen at this point. Monsieur le maire, on vous accueille et on aimerait bien apprendre de votre expérience au Sénégal. Donc, à vous la parole.
Merci, vous m'entendez?
Oui, on vous entend, merci.
Voilà, donc je peux démarrer ma présentation, c'est bien ça? Oui. Voilà, donc je voulais vous...
Interprétation, s'il vous plaît, vous pouvez donc écouter.
D'accord, je salue tout le monde et je voulais me remercier les organisateurs de m'avoir associé à cette importante rencontre d'échange et cette rencontre de partage. Pour me présenter, je suis le maire de la commune de Ndiop, qui est une commune engagée dans la transition écologique et qui, depuis 3 ans, travaille un peu vraiment à prendre en charge les effets des changements climatiques dans notre commune. Nous y reviendrons tout à l'heure. Le fond du problème qui est aujourd'hui posé, c'est l'absence de données ou l'insuffisance de données pour permettre aux élus locaux de pouvoir disposer des fonds qui sont nécessaires au financement de leurs projets. C'est le cas. Mais je pense qu'il y a un préalable à poser pour comprendre bien, en fait, les questions, le problème, et ne pas le prendre simplement de manière assez superficielle. Le problème, il faut le comprendre ainsi. D'une part, il y a des fonds qui sont disponibles et des bailleurs qui sont prêts à financer. D'autre part, dans les territoires que nous dirigeons, il y a des besoins importants qui existent et qui ont besoin de financement. Vous voyez donc, il y a une sorte de contradiction. D'une part, les fonds sont disponibles, de l'autre côté, les besoins existent, mais on ne parvient pas à faire la jonction requise pour ceux qui ont besoin de financement pour accéder au financement. Alors, ce problème-là, quand on essaie d'expliquer, pour ne pas dire quand on essaie de situer les responsabilités, il y a 2 responsabilités. Il y a une responsabilité qui provient des bailleurs, des structures d'appui et d'accompagnement. Pourquoi? Puisque l'outil financier, le financement est un outil. Quand on construit un outil, on doit veiller à ce que cet outil soit adapté aux besoins. Un outil est défini, un outil c'est pour faire un travail précis en fonction de la matière. Il est modulé, structuré en fonction du travail qu'il doit faire. Donc je pense qu'au niveau des bailleurs, il y a une insuffisance, en tout cas, l'outil n'est pas suffisamment adapté aux réalités de terrain que vivent les collectivités territoriales. Et ce qui fait qu'il y a une partie de blocage, et ça vient de là. La deuxième chose, toujours au niveau des bailleurs, qui a construit ces outils? Ces outils sont construits par la plupart par des experts très forts, très intelligents, très compétents en matière de changement climatique. Mais est-ce que ces outils ont été construits de manière inclusive? Les outils de financement, les conditionnalités, les montants, est-ce qu'ils ont été conçus de manière inclusive avec les bénéficiaires, c'est-à-dire les élus qui existent dans les collectivités territoriales? Ou bien ils ont été structurés, définis, et qu'on demande maintenant aux collectivités territoriales de venir s'ajuster et de venir s'adapter. C'est ça, en fait, un problème important. Je pense que, et je prends un exemple, le Fonds vert climat, qui a un outil important, mais déjà, pour avoir un minimum de financement, le projet le plus bas, on doit être à 6 milliards de francs CFA. Ce n'est pas toutes les communes qui peuvent monter des projets de 6 milliards. Donc, ce dispositif n'est pas adapté. C'est pourquoi je dis, les outils conçus en dehors des élus, et la base devait être là, c'est-à-dire partir avec les élus, partir avec les réalités et construire des outils en fonction de la réalité de terrain. Je pense que c'est ce qui a manqué de ce côté-là. Mais de l'autre côté aussi, il y a une part de responsabilité qui revient aux élus. Puisque les élus, ils sont élus pour des mandats courts de 4 à 5 ans et qu'ils ont tendance à gérer leurs urgences. Ils ont tendance à prendre en compte, à répondre aux besoins des populations urgentes. Et les changements climatiques, c'est un peu dans le long terme. On peut ne pas avoir les résultats tout de suite. Et que donc, l'élu cherchant par nature à satisfaire les besoins des populations, et ces besoins des populations ne sont pas formulés en termes de besoins d'action dans le changement climatique, mais ils sont formulés en termes d'énergie, en termes d'entrants, en termes de route. Donc, l'élu voit dans son dispositif vraiment à court terme comment je peux profiter des financements qui existent pour pouvoir satisfaire telle ou telle revendication des populations à la base. Donc, la prise en charge du changement climatique n'est pas un motif à la base. Ce n'est pas ça qui nous pousse à agir. Ce n'est pas ça qui nous pousse à intervenir. Il a un besoin, il veut électrifier un village, il se dit comment je peux profiter des dispositifs de financement verts qui existent pour répondre à ce besoin. Donc ça aussi, c'est un problème au niveau des élus. La deuxième chose, toujours au niveau local, c'est que on voit dans les objectifs, dans les programmes des élus, des maires, quand ils présentent leur programme pour être élus, ils vont dire que oui, je vais faire des écoles, je vais faire des postes de santé, je vais donner des intrants agricoles, je vais faire des infrastructures. Mais lisez bien le programme, la présence, le souci de prise en compte des changements climatiques est très peu développé dans les programmes qui sont proposés pour être élus. Ce qui fait qu'on met dans les programmes ce qui est nécessaire, ce qui est visible. On gère les conséquences des changements climatiques, mais on ne prend pas les changements climatiques dans leur globalité. Et ça, c'est assez important. Et là où je voulais conclure sur ce point-là aussi, c'est que dans l'approche globale, que ce soit au niveau des élus, que ce soit au niveau des bailleurs, une politique de prise en compte de changement climatique est une politique globale. On l'a trop sectorialisé. On ne peut pas détacher l'énergie, les constructions écologiques, le transport. C'est un ensemble qui intervient dans le changement climatique. C'est une question de séquestration du carbone. On ne peut pas les isoler. Et les fonds qui existent, c'est des fonds qui disent j'ai des fonds pour l'énergie solaire, j'ai des fonds pour faire le reboisement, j'ai des fonds pour faire la RNA, j'ai des fonds pour... Mais il n'y a pas... C'est pas une préoccupation holistique, globale, alors que dans la nature, tout est holistique, tout est imbriqué. Il est insensé, à mon avis, de faire beaucoup de, de l'énergie solaire, de mettre de la centrale solaire à côté. Et à côté, de favoriser l'émergence d'une agriculture conventionnelle qui passe tout son temps à couper et à utiliser des pesticides chimiques et des engrais chimiques de synthèse qui détruisent la nature. Donc, on doit voir le problème globalement. On ne doit pas là veiller à l'énergie solaire et de là-bas prendre des actions et des programmes qui détruisent la nature. C'est parce que la vision n'est pas globale. Et la vision... Oui.
Grand merci, Monsieur le maire, pour cette perspective très importante directement du terrain. Et on a bien compris que quelquefois les outils qu'on utilise ne sont pas forcément adaptés pour les approches inclusives qu'on voudrait et qu'il faut aussi une approche globale. Donc, j'espère qu'on reviendra sur ces préoccupations pendant la session de questions. Et encore une fois, grand merci. Et avec cela, on va tourner vers notre troisième intervenant, encore avec des grands remerciements pour votre participation. So again, I was thanking the mayor very warmly, and I'm inviting the third panelist, which will be David Dodman. David, we look forward to hearing from your experience at IIED in accessing and making sense of data in short timeframes. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much. Can I just have a nod that you can hear me okay? Perfect. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. And thanks to ICLEI for organizing the session and for inviting such a great set of people. I suppose that this is one of the advantages of a lockdown, that you get to engage with people even if you're far away from each other. I think we should be recalling this in this particular setting, a LOCS down, which I think is great. And the question asked to me highlights some aspects of uncertainty and change. And I think one reflection on this is the need not to be paralyzed by uncertainty, but to act in the face of it. The question asked to me also points out the actions that must be taken by cities so that cities are not left behind. And I'd like to expand my focus slightly to also talk about the people who are not to be left behind as well. And to do that, I'd like to just make two brief points of analysis and two brief related points of action. So the 2 points of analysis. Firstly, is that there are obviously huge differences between cities in terms of the extent and nature of the climate data gap that they face. And the nature of this gap is informed both by differences in the climate and differences in the capacity that cities have to generate and analyze data. Equally though, but perhaps less obviously, there are huge differences within cities and between the data needs and the data capacities of different actors. And those of us who work in urban areas will often reflect that they're not monolithic. The whole purpose, the reason why cities exist, is to bring together diverse groups of people, ideally for mutual benefit. But of course, we also know that there are going to be multiple tensions between groups within cities. There are always political tensions. Sometimes there are equilibrium, but very often there is not an equilibrium. So for any city, I don't think there is a single data gap that needs to be addressed, but rather multiple data gaps that are defined by the interests, needs, and priorities of different groups. And the approach that we take to climate change can help to inform these gaps as well. Those of us who work on climate change will often divide up climate risk into components of hazards, exposure, and vulnerability. And it's very easy to say identify the climate data gap as being one around hazards and exposure, but particularly for low income and other marginalized groups in cities, and the climate data gap around vulnerability, what drives vulnerability and the different vulnerabilities groups face is very important. So particularly for low income groups, the biggest data gaps may be around vulnerability, because that may be the most significant driver of risk for them. The second analysis point related to that is that data is always political as well as technical. The decisions about what data is collected and how to use that data inevitably creates winners and losers. And so if we're talking about how to address the data gap, we need to make sure that the data collected doesn't highlight the interests or priorities of one group over another group, that it doesn't perpetrate environmental or social injustices. So that relates to the type of data that's collected around climate, including whether it's hazard data or vulnerability data. But it also relates to how decisions are made about priorities for data. So, for example, decisions about the safe setback from rivers or the safe setback from coasts are going to be informed, of course, by technical and often well-justified technical decisions, but the outcomes of these can have particular political consequences for different groups. Briefly then, two related points of how we should respond to these. The first is for local governments and the second is for funding agencies. So for local governments, the need to generate data consistently, but also to recognize the abilities of communities to generate quantitative data. Many good examples from around Africa and around the world of how grassroots organizations living in low-income and informal settlements have generated data that can help to have a better understanding of the quality of life, the quality of the living environment, and some of the impacts of disasters and climate change. But also recognize the validity of different forms of knowledge. I've been spending my evenings and early mornings this week working on the latest draft of the IPCC report, the chapter on cities and settlements. And a really strong message that's coming from that is the importance of indigenous knowledges in urban settings, as well as in some of the more rural settings where we may be more accustomed to taking them into account. And these indigenous knowledge can be very culturally appropriate and can also link with different forms of decision-making and governance that are effective at reducing risk. And for funders, then the need also to recognize some of these same things as well, and the need to consistently and holistically generate data collection, generate data, the need to recognize different forms of data and knowledge. So in some ways, just to close, I'm not really proposing a technical fix around the climate data gap, but proposing something that's more conceptual in of the way that the climate data gap is framed as a starting point for addressing these different data gaps. And key elements to this are different ways of approaching data, different ways of appreciating knowledge, which have a more fundamental role in reshaping relationships between urban residents and the cities that they live in.
Thank you so much, David, for that reminder that we have to act even in the face of uncertainty, and the reminders about data being not just technical, but political, and the need to embrace different kinds of knowledge, among other important issues. Thank you so much. And now we will be inviting Catherine Kingman, who has turned on her camera, to share from her experience at CDP. And among other things, I understand you might be talking about why reporting is so important and how reporting can support proposal development. Over to you, Catherine.
Yes, thank you so much, Catherine. I hope you can hear me. And thank you to all of the colleagues at ICLEI Africa and the other organizations involved in creating this fantastic LOCS4Africa virtual Congress for the opportunity to speak. So as you say, I've been asked to speak briefly today about the importance of environmental reporting and how this can support cities with proposal development. And so I'm planning to cover three things in my response. Firstly, just a brief introduction to what environmental reporting is, and specifically to the CDP ICLEI unified reporting system, which Megan was mentioning earlier. Then I want to speak a little bit about how that can directly support cities with proposal development. And then if there's time, and I will try and stick to my time limit, I also want to speak a little bit about how the data that we gather through the unified reporting system can have a huge kind of more indirect impact on the development of resources to support cities, even if it's not a tool that's being used by cities themselves. So the idea behind environmental reporting is simple. Cities, like other real economy actors around the globe, have a responsibility to tackle climate impacts and to manage climate risks. But, as we've heard from so many of the speakers today, you really can't manage what you don't measure. If we don't have the data to understand those climate risks and impacts, we can't address them. So the CDP-ICLEI Unified Reporting System, which is the largest global platform for city reporting and one of the official platforms for the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, provides a framework to allow cities to understand the most relevant data and indicators that can be required for successful climate action. We also provide feedback and resources to reporting cities to help them to develop increasing quantities of data to be used in climate action planning, and to do this in a way that is kind of transparent and can be where their progress can be monitored by anyone from across the global community, whether that's the citizens of a given city or others working within this ecosystem. We also provide ways for cities to benchmark themselves against their peers and to learn best practice and innovative approaches from one another. So, you know, David's been talking about the need when we're thinking about climate risk and vulnerability to really focus in on that point about vulnerability and who is vulnerable and who needs to be kind of considered when we're thinking about adaptive capacity. And we have some of the cities that have reported the work that they're doing through the unified reporting system have been reporting some really interesting uses of participatory approaches to climate action planning and to developing climate risk and vulnerability assessments, which we hope can be replicated by other cities through being able to access that data on our system. So to touch then on how reporting can help cities with proposal development, well, cities using the framework provided by the system are really encouraged and incentivized to develop comprehensive climate action plans underpinned by rigorous assessments of both climate risks and vulnerabilities and climate impacts and greenhouse gas emissions. And we have designed the platform in a way that can be quite flexible as to the methodology that cities use to gather that data so that it can be responsive to local contexts. But a city that has gathered that data and can demonstrate through their environmental reporting that a specific project proposal fits within a more holistic framework of a climate action plan that's based on a kind of very comprehensive overview of the city's underlying data, can really position themselves much better to attract funding for that project. We've heard already about the importance of being able to show that a solution has been selected specifically against others. So we've recently analysed some of the data submitted by 40 cities in countries on the OECD's Overseas Development Assistance list this year. And we can see that of those cities, only 11 have indicated that they've recently received funding for their climate action projects from a development bank or another supranational body. More than 90% of those 11 cities had a risk assessment completed or in progress. And all of them had an emissions inventory either completed or in progress. Whereas if we look at that group of cities, the remainder who didn't report receiving funding, we see that only 75% had a risk and vulnerability assessment completed or in progress, and only 60% had an emissions inventory completed or in progress. So we seem to see a real correlation between cities with more comprehensive data and cities receiving funding for their projects from some of these sources. So I'm conscious of time and I just want to touch briefly on more indirect ways in which reporting can support proposal development as well. So over time, data collected through the CDP-ICLEI system has played a really key role in helping diverse international actors and in some cases national scale actors to understand where support is needed to help cities turn climate action projects from vision to reality. So to give just one recent example of this, the recently launched City Climate Gap Fund, which is an initiative supported by the Global Covenant of Mayors and a number of other partners, and which is designed to support cities with both funding and technical assistance for getting projects through the early phases of project preparation and development to a bankable stage. That fund was developed following in part a report produced in 2018 by CDP and the C40 City Finance Facility. And that report contained a really detailed analysis of data that had been reported by cities through the system about the needs and challenges that they were facing. And that helped to kind of zero in on this issue of early stage project preparation and development as the place where cities were most in need of support. So to round off and just give a kind of further final example of how reporting data through the system can be useful, CDP, in addition to working with cities to report and gather environmental data, also works with over 650 institutional investors from around the world. And these investors are increasingly interested in the data reported by cities. And we know of a recent example of a city in the US, Cleveland in Ohio, that issued a municipal bond, an investor that decided, even though this wasn't a green bond or a sustainable bond, that they wanted to know whether this city was taking action on climate and environmental issues before deciding whether to invest in that and to purchase those bonds. And so they looked to the data on gathered through the CDP ICLEI system as a way of finding that out. So just to conclude, because I'm conscious of time, reporting data through the system allows cities to profile their climate actions and ambitions to a really wide range of stakeholders, and using the framework provided can also help cities to understand those data gaps.
Catherine, thank you so much for that quick overview of environmental reporting, unified reporting, participatory approaches, and also the insights into the CDP and ICLEI platform, and the need, again, to make data pertinent for the local context. Thank you so much. And with that, we turn over to Mr. Kudzai Nzizano in a pre-recorded message.
My name is Kudzai Nzizano. I'm the Deputy Director in the Climate Change Management Department, the Ministry of Environment, Climate, Tourism and Hospitality Industry in Zimbabwe. And I think over the years, we've been taking action on climate change, specifically mitigation and adaptation. And we have realized that the importance of getting data to inform the respective interventions. And for now, what we have been doing, we have been getting, we have a national statistical agency, which is the custodian of most of the national statistics that is collected and they archive it for use in the various projects. But what we have recognized now, what we have observed is that at times the data is incomplete in terms of the methodologies that we will be using. Because, for example, for mitigation actions, in terms of quantifying emission reduction, emission generation, we've been using the standardized intergovernmental panel on climate change methodologies. Much of the challenge has been on the format of the data, where at times it's too aggregated that you cannot really use it. You need some further disaggregation. Also, the absence of some of the data in terms of the sources of data is statistical agents, where it's not enough, then we need to move to the sectoral data providers. This could be local authorities, if it's waste. We can also go to energy, industry, and agriculture and forestry sectors. Then with regard to adaptation as well, we have not been having enough baseline information, like when it comes to maybe to actually have a proper definition of the country's risk and vulnerability, which has been missing. So that's the challenge we have. So even when using IPCC methodology, much of the methodologies that are used now, they're using Tier 1 methodologies, which has generalized sort of emission factors, because we do not have enough activity data, but also enough research to actually develop our own country-specific emission factors. So with regard to local authorities, mitigation and adaptation activity, I can safely say we didn't start a long while ago, but we are more in the early stages of actual engagement with local authorities, where we had some focal points, now we have been engaging quite more often. But then the intention is to have a more comprehensive program where we capacitate the local authorities For example, we're targeting now, we're starting with the capital city, Harare, because that's where the bulk of urban population is resident in. Where now, with also other impact program, they've been capacitated, and now we're setting up a climate change desk within the local authority, which now as a department we are going to support in terms of capacitating the whole of council in terms of awareness and on climate change issues. Then also the production of information that they can now use in the information brochures as they engage with other cities residents, try and build their capacity, raise awareness of climate change mitigation and adaptation programs. Then we're also trying to look at partners, potential partners who can support now further rollout of the training and capacity building to other local authorities across the country. But our aim is to start with capacitating the capital city so that they can also inspire other local authorities. I think in terms of the success stories, that what we've learned over the years is it is critical to actually start by building the necessary capacity of respective institutions, especially those that you hope will be able to provide you with data. Because of course they've been collecting data for a long while, but then when it comes to NDCs and climate change mitigation reporting, it needs to be further disaggregated so that they actually draw meaningful results from such data. So what we've learned is it's important to engage at an early stage, and also the external support from partners is very crucial. At the time they would not be very much willing to come and talk, but then when you have also like a third partner who is more or less neutral between government and local authorities, then they are able now to convene government and local authorities and at least set the tone for further engagement. Maybe as central government, we tend to be focused more on the proper central governance infrastructure and leaving out these critical constituents of local authorities where the actual issues and challenges and possible solutions can be found. So this is one important lesson that I've learned over the process. So this is one of the aspects that we've had some support. And also in terms of local authorities and sub-national authorities, which are a bit difficult to get data from, through the impact project, we have also had platforms where we are engaging with sub-national authorities, where we build capacity also with facilitation of ICLEI Africa, in terms of for them understanding the importance of reporting. And we are actually trying to come up with a more robust reporting framework and capacity building to enhance the capacity of local authorities in terms of how can they collect relevant data for mitigation and adaptation, as well as actions and plans that they may be having, and also link them to other support facilities where now they can implement mitigation and adaptation measures. In terms of the collaboration with research fraternity, we are starting as well, because I think much of the time, in terms of, I think it was more of an institutional approach, where due to limited technical expertise and resources, we prioritize sectors given their also contribution to the national greenhouse gas emissions. So we started with energy, agriculture, now we're moving into waste. But now we are quite engaged, and with also local universities, for example, Harare Institute of Technology, they have a strong institute working on waste, as well as University of Technology, who are also part of the impact project. So they actually form the base in terms of also in their involvement in fractal and impact projects, where they also bring in some insights from other countries where they've been working with, like for example, Lusaka and Namibia, and also imparting the same knowledge and information to our own city of Harare. And I think that is the reason or the background as to why now even it was a bit easier to actually engage the local authorities of Harare, and they agreed and actually created an environmental management unity at the top, which is also coordinated from the top technical office in the council, which is the town clerk's office. So I think the research has a critical role, especially when you look at the challenges that we have as Harare in terms of waste management. So you need to engage the research fraternity to actually come up with modern and sustainable ways of managing waste, which are actually customized to the prevailing conditions for our local authorities here. And also in terms of other ways we have been going around, we are thankful to also ICLEI Africa for their support through NDC review process for the country, where they have assisted in terms of coming up with a nationwide risk and vulnerability, which shall now form the basis for adaptation actions. Also, as we develop the NDC component of the adaptation component of our revised NDC, we intend to submit in early 2020. Deadline was 2020, but then due to the COVID-19, we faced some delays, and we are hoping to do that early in 2021.
So I think I speak on behalf of all of us in appreciating the representative from Zimbabwe's Ministry of Environment, Climate Change and Tourism for sending that message to us to share their experiences. And we will be moving to the sixth and final participant. And feel free to go to the question and answer section on your platform if you would like to pose a question to any of the panelists in case we have time to take them. So with that, over to Richard Jones to hear in part about drawing on related disciplines in undertaking climate action. Over to Richard in a pre-recorded intervention.
Thank you very much for the question. My name is Richard Jones, and I work at the Met Office Hadley Centre in the UK. I'm a climate scientist, but I've had a long involvement in generating climate information. I've been working in the sort of what I call the regional climate information field, which is my background now for basically 30 years. The last 20 or so, I've become sort of edging closer towards what I would call real applications of the information. The last 10 years or so, working quite a lot with DFID in African climate science projects. Most recently, you probably come across Fractal, the project that we've got in Southern Africa. So I've been I'm the Met Office PI on that. So back to your question. Well, at least the first part of it, I would certainly agree that understanding climate risk is not necessarily straightforward, and that the complexities of identifying and understanding the reasons for climate impacts are a major challenge. However, before I address these issues, there are 3 points I would like to make about the climate drivers of these impacts and risks. The first is that there are many aspects of the future climate, especially those related to temperature, that we are quite certain about. For example, increases in temperature extremes, evaporation, and the sea levels. Second, whilst there may be aspects of future climate change that we are less certain about, heavy and extreme rainfall is expected to increase in many cases, even when the total amount might decrease. Third, we mustn't forget that we are currently living in a world which is warmer by over a degree compared to what people consider to be the pre-industrial climate. And so understanding the climate that we are experiencing now will give us a good guide to what to expect over the coming decade or so, and also further into the future if we do manage to keep the global warming level to less than 1.5 degrees. Now, onto the issue of understanding the impacts and risks. It is certainly the case, as in your question, that several related disciplines are required, and that a particular impact will require bespoke treatment, which depends on the context of the people or the systems or the infrastructure that are at risk. However, it is recognising this that provides the opportunity to find solutions to the problem. The thing that it is at risk will involve people and institutions and information which are already out there which can provide some insight into the problem or are already engaged in trying to solve it. So we're not starting here from a blank slate at all. There are a lot of actors are already involved in aspects of the issue that we're dealing with. The key is then to set up forums and networks and processes to bring these insights all together and to connect them with relevant resources, which could be some sort of expertise involving institutions from sort of local to national scale, including community level or government or utilities, who can then are able to come together to generate and implement solutions. So this is where the different disciplines come in being able to set up and to facilitate these forums and networks and processes, and from which will come the extensive bespoke analysis and also the formulation of actions. So, for example, I've been very privileged, in fact, to be part of a project working in Lusaka in Zambia, looking at water-related issues in informal settlements. This has involved the city council and the university as key partners, who have convened a wide range of stakeholders, which has involved community groups, to water supply and sanitation utilities, to city and national governments, and international NGOs and research partners such as myself. In this project, through a series of dialogues and engagements with a wide range of actors, the dimensions of the issues were explored. Information was generated on a diverse set of areas such as governance and decision making and science, which was relevant to the issue, and was looking at how we could build on and integrate existing activities and promote new actions to improve the water security and health outcomes for the affected populations. Lusaka was one of our 3 what we call tier 1 cities that we were working in. So in terms of particular successes within the work we were doing there, I think there was a lot of learning that went on. We all learned an enormous amount about how to bring people together, how to involve ourselves in an iterative process, to be able to identify what issues were, to find the right people to come together, how to set up interactions that allowed people to really share information, how to resolve there were often some tensions in the group, and how to resolve those, and how the importance of building a network of people who were able to really easily interact and communicate. I mean, we broke down silos within local government, for example, and also between institutions, either sort of research institutions, universities, utilities, and community groups, and all able to come around the table and be able to, speak with each other and share in a very sort of open and constructive way. So those were some of the highlights. I would love to spend more time explaining the main details of the processes and principles involved, but unfortunately, in the time I have available, I really aren't able to go into this. But I would like to leave you with the message that there are definitely ways to overcome this challenge in Africa, and that there are already many examples out there of how it can happen. So many thanks again for the opportunity to present at this meeting, and I wish you fruitful interactions and discussions in the rest of this session. Thank you very much.
It was great to hear from Professor Richard Jones at the UK's Met Office, and to once again hear about the theme of collaboration, particularly in the case of the experience he related in Zambia. Thanks also to those who have submitted questions. We had a couple of questions coming in. We do have a half an hour left in this session, and we have a roundtable to discuss what we just heard from the panelists. So I am going to be turning over to Megan, who will facilitate the roundtable. And then if we have time at the end, we'll take those questions that have been coming in. So thanks to all the panelists and to those who've been listening so astutely and sending questions as well. Over to you, Megan.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and thanks to all the speakers. I forgot to do it on my intro, but I just wanted to do a shout out to all the Impact Project team members that are joining us from Malawi and Zimbabwe. We know you're on the line and on the platform, so hello to you and thanks so much for joining. I was so encouraged by all of the different speakers. You know, in convening a session like this, one might expect there to be a lot of discussions around the challenges of lack of data, but actually there was a golden thread almost through all the speakers' conversations around the need for storylines, the importance of indigenous knowledge, the importance of speaking across disciplines. And the sense I at least got is that the feeling is that there is data out there, there is knowledge out there, but we need to be more open structurally and in the way we do our work and in the processes in which we gather this data and then analyze it to different forms of data, and breaking down the power dynamics that have avoided those in the past potentially of having their voices heard. So with that said, I want to receive some reflections from the rest of our panelists, and I think I'm going to first turn to Colleen, perhaps, if you don't mind, Colleen, just sharing some thoughts from your perspective in terms of what you've heard in the first part of the session.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me. Thank you all, and thank you very much for this chance to be on this wonderful panel and to listen to everything that I've just heard. You know, lots of great things that were coming up, you know, issues of that context matters, that there's diversity, that we've got to be aware of contradictions and tensions, etc., etc. But one of the things that I really want to frame my inputs about, and maybe go back to some of the speakers if they can comment, or maybe the rest of this panel can comment. One of my concerns is what is behind the data collection. So I think we run around collecting data, but I often think that we're not framing the questions. And that goes back to our first opening speaker, who really made, I think, a brilliant point about multiple data sources. And David also, I think, referred to that. Who's telling the story? Who's setting this agenda? And I think we need to be a lot more critical about why we're collecting data. So in my experience, many people are rushing around doing vulnerability assessments, ticking boxes. Through that, many cities, because they don't have capacity, they hire consultants. So even the city themselves sometimes don't know why they're collecting this data. So my kind of question is, what is lying behind the data collection? Are we trying to do smart data like we've been trying to do smart cities? And where's Africa's voice in that? And I think the funders can play a fundamental role in helping us to capture the African narrative. So I'll stop there. That's my first intervention. And then if I've got time, I'll come back with some others. So it's what's behind, why are we collecting this data? And for whose purpose? So the climate justice issues, the structural constraints. We can go out and do all this work with cities. We can do participatory analysis until we kind of blue in the face. But what difference is it making and whose agenda is it serving? Thanks.
Thanks so much, Colleen. I actually think it would be good if we could pick up that thread. I wonder if either Valentina or Daniel, perhaps just by raising your hand, I can see your videos, feel you can respond to some of the things that Colleen is raising, or in fact, any of the speakers. Feel free to unmute yourself, put your videos on. Let's try and make this session interactive now. We would love to hear your thoughts. So I'm looking at the screen to see who I can see. I can see Daniel. I can see Valentina. Neither of you. Valentina, yay. Over to you. Let's hear your input.
Hi everyone, and thank you for this opportunity today. I think also Daniel raised these hands. Am I correct? In any case.
We'll go to Daniel next. We'll say ladies first.
Okay. Well, I will start with a quick comment of Colleen. I think that she pointed out a very important point, since the reason behind and the methodology behind is crucial for this for the future. I would just like to highlight the fact that the data collection is a key moment towards the sustainability, but is also a challenge, especially for the process to do it. But let's have a look at what cities can reach with a good data collection and that good data reporting. You know, because you have said that I'm working at JRC, and within JRC, we are working with the Covenant of Mayors in Sub-Saharan Africa that collect cities and gather cities voluntarily committed to take action against climate change in their territories. So what they can do, if and with a good reporting of data, it is possible, for example, to have a better knowledge of their current condition in their territories, in the fields of energy consumption, in the fields of risks and vulnerable groups. So they will be able to understand and to highlight which are the vulnerable groups and which impacts may come to their territory. Moreover, in the Covenant of Mayors, we work with plans. That means that based on this knowledge of the current condition through the data collection and reporting, it will be possible to plan strategies and actions to take climate change and to reach their target. So this was just a quick overview of the role of the data in my view and in what we are doing here at JRC.
Thanks so much, Valentina. Daniel, some reflections from you.
Sure, maybe two quick points perhaps. One, I teach a graduate course on energy systems, and we have 22 students, and they're all assigned to do a long-term energy plan for a city in Africa. So they've looked at Kinshasa and Lusaka and Dar es Salaam, and they're all numbers-oriented engineers. They go find the data, and the thing that strikes everyone the most when they present their information is the narrative of how little energy is used or how high indoor air pollution is, and these sorts of things relative to their own lives, and they're still fairly young, but having good enough data that enables them to then develop a story around what's happening is very, very powerful. So I'm really happy to hear about this narrative comment that's emerging, and the value that David had mentioned about Indigenous voices. Here in Canada, more than half of our Indigenous people live in cities. And now the trick is, I think, to get the narrative that includes everybody. And another comment perhaps on, well, both, I suppose, the value of having people agree on what should be measured and how it should be measured is as important as the numbers. And I think ICLEI deserves a lot of credit, the partnership with CDP and WRI and C40 on how to measure greenhouse gas emissions in a city. ICLEI just went out and did that. Those numbers are now considered the best numbers that are out there, and people have moved on from what should we measure, how should we measure, and they're starting to look at the numbers. And to be able to develop these partnerships is really, really powerful. And the last comment that I would make is, sometimes we worry too much about getting good numbers and not enough on providing a reason why these numbers are important. And I'm still sort of watching the election unfold in the US. And here we know that climate change is very, very serious, yet half the people in the United States voted for a program that has nothing to do with climate change, really. And that isn't because they don't have the numbers or the data isn't accurate or insufficient data. It's because the narrative has they have not figured out how that narrative applies to them and what they can do. So, and I think that that's the message that needs to come from cities through good use of data is, hey folks, this is Lusaka, for example, here's our numbers, here's the data, and this is what it means in terms of climate change, risk mitigation, vis-a-vis the United States. And the way to do that is sort of a common language of data, but it has to be used to tell a story, I think, a good narrative. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. In true Colleen style, we seem to have got our panelists very keen to all make input, which is wonderful. So Kudzai, we hear that you've got a response to Colleen's first reflections. Over to you.
Okay, thanks, Megan, and good afternoon, good morning to everyone. Yeah, I think in terms of the reasons behind the data collection, like in our case at national level, we require the data on a number of issues. The first one will be on the proposal development, as highlighted by previous speakers, where we need to have solid information to feed into as background information to the proposal development, as well as the projections for the future. Then also for planning purposes, for example, I think in most of these developing third world cities, waste management is a bit of a challenge, and there's more of an ad hoc approach to the management. So if you have the figures to demonstrate how much are you generating, how much is being separated, then this will really be helpful. And also in line with global maybe commitments and obligations being party to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, we are also obliged to report in terms of emissions per sector, energy, industry, agriculture, as well as the waste sector, where most local authorities are actually belong to. So in that, you need to have adequate data in terms of the activity data, how much they are generating and how much of it is wastewater, how much is going to the wastewater plans, for example, so that you can also see the management practice and inform like climate change mitigation actions based on the volumes that they are generating. So that's another use. Then also in terms of the reporting for the GHG greenhouse gas emissions inventories, this is like an obligation which you need to fulfill as a nation. So you need to have data. But then the challenge, like in the pre-recorded presentation, is mostly on the disaggregation of the data. At times it's largely lumped up. Then there are also data gaps. You don't know how to fill those gaps. At times, even there's need for capacity in terms of how can they now actually have a sustainable system to capture this data and archive it so that when you need it, you readily access it. So that would be my response, Colleen.
Thanks, Kudzai. We'll fire back to Colleen, and then Catherine Higgins going to make a point, and then I'd also love to hear back to our AFDB colleague. I think the bank could also weigh in on this particular point, but Colleen?
Yeah, so I think just to reiterate my point, I'm not, decrying all the greenhouse gas emission inventory data collections, etc. But I really do think Africa needs to come into its own voice and really critiquing what kind of data we're collecting, why we're collecting it. So in the cities in Africa, we all know they're complex. It's a complex informality. Sometimes you can't even, you don't even know who you actually should be targeting, etc., etc. So I come back to my point, is why are we collecting this data? And I think we have started to address this a little bit. So I just would like to maybe throw questions, if I could, via you, to David. For example, even the notion of indigenous knowledge, is that the appropriate, or is it more local tacit knowledge? So I think what I'm suggesting is that some of the questions and the roads that we take are often framed outside of our contexts. And how do we build our capacities to start critiquing what data we should be getting? Is this the kind of data we really need, etc., etc.? Not to make us, be put in the corner and being wrapped on the knuckles and told naughty children, but I really do think we don't have enough time. We need to be much stronger in critiquing. So I think the segue to our African Development Bank colleague, where he said, what kind of stories, that narrative, whose stories are we collecting? I really would just like to leave that as a take-home message. Thanks.
Awesome, Colleen. David?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't come in because I felt that Colleen had made the point very, very well before. I suppose what I would add is that we're often too quick to identify the sort of data that we think matters, and too slow to ask people what are the issues that they think matter, and where we could be not just not both collecting data of different forms, but also asking questions that are informed by the people who are most affected. And of course, here I'm talking primarily in the vulnerability and adaptation space rather than in the carbon and mitigation space. I'd add one other imperative for it as well, though. And I think the additional imperative for this is around accountability. That we often talk about data being necessary in order to be accountable somehow to funding agencies, accountable somehow to international processes. But of course, the only purpose for these processes is to improve lives, well-being, resilience, and the global environment. And so if we're not accountable to the people whose lives we're committed to improving and who it is the goal of these systems and processes to improving, then we're missing out one of the most important elements of accountability.
Thanks, David. I'd like to then just hear a few thoughts from Funzo and then go to Catherine, and then I think our time will almost be up at that point. But Funzo, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you to all of you. This has been a very, very fruitful conversation. I think I'm happy that we are talking from the same template here in terms of what we should be doing differently in our continent. I'd like to end with 2 points. Number one, it's important to emphasize the fact that if we're beginning to move into an era where in order for you to access finance, you must show data, then, and I feel that that is very misleading, because the data we need it for beyond, it's valuable much more beyond accessing a green climate fund or even having global environmental facility. We need this data for even our farmers, so we can create a democratization process where both the generation and the use of data is wide shared across the country. You know, nothing stops a high school in a city to produce meteorological data that fits into, you know, the central system. And at the same time, nothing stops the central system to produce data for local farmers on their phone that can help them during their planting and as well as harvesting season. So it's very important that we devolve this data beyond a national system into bringing in a lot of partners on the ground. And the second point as well is to continue to encourage a lot of the African government to see the value of it, and also to be able to push that voice of, let's say in the African context, there will be stories. No single data will tell the perfect story. No single data. We need a combination of data. You know, there will be stories that local knowledge will be able to tell. When I was younger, growing up in rural Nigeria, our grandparents told us that if you saw the movement of certain insects, it was an indication of changes in the weather system. And this was based on over years. If you also saw movement of certain birds, it was also telling you that the cloud or temperature was going to change. We need to find a way to systematize the collection of that data, the verification of it, so that in the African context, we have a system that combines both the scientific data and the local data as well in a very systematic way that becomes very applicable for you know, responding to climate change. And the last point as well is, you know, we tend to mainstream climate change in all our development operations across the continent. And I'm talking about the African Development Bank. And it's very important that at every point in time, adaptation must be at the very core of everything that we do. And these are some of the evidence or types of adaptation projects that we look at across the continent. Thank you.
Thanks, Funzo. Catherine, if you maybe want to weigh in for a minute, and then I just want to give our reflection panelists 1 minute each to close our session, and then we will be out of time. So Catherine, over to you, and then we'll give a minute to each of our reflection panelists.
Thank you so much. And I will try and be quick to make sure that the panelists have enough time to speak. So I wanted to make 2 points. First, just to respond to Colleen's point about, you know, who is this data for and who is it used by? And that point you made that I think is so, you know, resonates so much about making sure that data isn't just collected by consultants so that it can then sit on a shelf and a city can say, we have our risk and vulnerability assessment, we've ticked that box. And I think, you know, one of the things that I find really encouraging when you look at the data that cities are reporting through the CDP-ICLEI system is that that's not what cities are doing with the data. That's not what they're doing with their risk and vulnerability assessments. A huge number of the actions, the adaptation actions that cities that have created these risk and vulnerability assessments subsequently report involve community engagement or trying to, you know, ensure that there's flood mapping at high risk areas or flood mapping in informal settlements involving communities and engaging them. So I think it's really crucial that city decision makers are very active and very involved in using and directing the use of the data. data. And I think that's something we certainly try and encourage. And then the second point I just wanted to make quickly is actually a plug. So CDP and ICLEI are currently in the process of conducting a consultation that ends later this month on the future direction of our questionnaire and the framework that it provides to cities around the world to develop their climate action and their climate action plans. And one of the things we're looking at is whether we may, develop different frameworks geared towards different typologies of cities. So I will speak to ICLEI colleagues about sharing that with participants in this session. And we would really, really welcome, any inputs, any interventions that anyone feels able to give. I'm assured that the consultation process only takes half an hour. So please do feed into that.
Thanks, Catherine. Great. So let's go a minute to Valentina, then a minute to Daniel, and then a minute to Colleen. Over to you, Valentina.
Thank you. I will be quick. I think it is important to highlight the fact that cities have a clear role now and data collection also, but that there are a lot of local and territorial specificities that occur and that we need to take on board. And this is also the reason why when we work with cities, and in particular in this region, we have developed an offline reporting tool for the cities to report their data. This was arisen after a long consultation process with the partners that required something that was available offline due to network constraint. It covers also with high flexibility all the pillars of the Covenant of Mayors. This is why, this is the reason to collect the data in a flexible way that be suitable, that can take care of the specificities of the region and of each cities, that will be able to understand the resource that they need to collect data, but also to provide and produce their plan. And thank you very much for this.
Thanks. Daniel?
Yeah, just to reiterate that I think trying to capture something as complex as a city is very, very difficult. No matter how good the data is, we're still using data really as a sort of tracking the animal by looking at the tracks in the sand 4 or 5 days later and trying to guess what the animal really is and what it was doing. Most of us, for example, we don't even know what the city is, what the geography is. We have it carved up politically, but it really is an urban agglomeration. It's messy. And I think we should always appreciate that the best data in the world is still an approximation of what's happening. Engineers especially, politicians especially, need to wrap their heads around this, that the data is steering us towards something, but that the narrative and the number of people who are behind the data is what's really important. I also think increasingly cities, the big messy larger cities especially, are going to have to use data more and more to get their voice heard in international circles, these sorts of things. And they'll need good common data, but they'll need more than anything to be able to say, here's who we are, here's what's happening, and people will learn how to respond to that data. For example, the finance institutions, the other governments. So we're really all in this together. And again, just to comment Valentina's, thanks very much for the opportunity.
Colleen, last thoughts from you.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I concur with what the other panelists have said. I guess my two parting points would be, what are we learning from COVID? So COVID has just kind of unleashed or taken the lid off the vulnerabilities that have always been there. Climate change kind of going to do the same. So it would seem that we might be missing a trick, because these issues of data and whose voices matter and the frontline workers, et cetera, I think it would be a missed opportunity if we didn't kind of look at some of that, and hopefully some of that is going to factor in. And then lastly, just to plug, I'm recently working with the youth in the city of Johannesburg, and I just think we need younger voices in these narratives, and just to endorse the point that it's what's behind the data and the story that we're trying to give, and hopefully the African voice can come through more and more and more. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Colleen. And thank you to all our panelists, and thank you to those that have posed questions. We'll do our best to direct them to the panelists and answer them as we can in the platform. This session will be available, recorded in the platform to you to access later and share with your networks. And please join upcoming sessions. There are many more as the LOCS4Africa Congress